Okay, well let's, we're going to get to 1 Timothy, finally today. Let's pray, because I'm a little bit nervous about trying to communicate this stuff, and yeah, I would like God to help me. Father, thank you for this class, thank you for your word, thank you for your spirit, which leads us into all truth, and I pray you would help us to follow the verse in Proverbs and not the verse in 1 Timothy 6. In Jesus' name, amen. We've been talking about the Trinity longer than we should have, longer than I intended, but it is a big subject. And the reason that I wanted to talk about it is to give us a worldview that I think is necessary to understand the really awkward passages that are coming up in 1 Timothy. I'm going to say a couple of things that I've said before. You don't have to agree with me. I'm presenting a perspective, and not everybody agrees with me on this. But I think the Bible presents the Trinity as a hierarchy of equals. That's foreign to us. We don't understand that because we live in a fallen world. In your folder, I think I passed out last week's 3 pages stapled together of subordination quotes. I don't want to go through all of them. All of them are by solid, thoughtful, evangelical Christians. All of them. Just to summarize what they all say, the second one down from the top on the first page, it should be either equality and no hierarchy, or hierarchy and no equality. There's people that believe that, obviously. A whole bunch of them on that page. I think that the Bible presents the Bible presents the Trinity as a hierarchy of equals. If that's true, then what he said there is not true. And in fact, what all those people say is not true. There's another page I handed out called Oneness.
But that's, like, I mean, if you go down to the second one from the bottom on the first page, is like the ontological relationship of pre-incarnate and submissive sonship most certainly entails that Christ is inferior to God. I mean, I think that's would be true. Because that would be in the nature of Christ's being. The second person of the Trinity is pre-incarnate, is always submissive in the nature of being. I mean, that would be inferior, and that would be violating the idea of the Trinity. So that's why it's difficult, because I mean I think I agree with that one, and I might not agree with some of the others, but I agree with that
Do you
one.
think Christ is inferior to God then?
No, I mean I think that what he's saying is that would be wrong. If that's what he's saying is wrong. If he's saying it's right, he's right. But I think he's saying it. If the second person of the Trinity is ontologically, like in the nature of his being, submissive. I think that's. Yeah, then that would be.
I think, and this is what we struggled with, and I continue to struggle with it, the ontological, meaning the essence of the second person is that he's submissive to the Father. I think that's true. I don't think that means he's inferior. Take it or leave it for what it means. But, the question is, why did God reveal himself as a Father and Son? Those are God's words, not mine. There's an interesting word in the Old Testament. I don't know Hebrew. I don't know Greek. So I go to the website Blue Letter Bible, which is very helpful. One of the things that's in that particular website is you can see how the same word is translated in different instances. In other words, people who do know Hebrew and Greek, they translate a particular word.
Which website is that?
I'm sorry?
Which website is that?
Blue Letter Bible.
Gotcha.
Really helpful.
I'd forgotten about it.
Yeah, it's really helpful if you want to see what Greek and Hebrew words are, what they mean, how the translators who do know Greek and Hebrew have translated them in different instances. This is the word echad in Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. That's the word that's translated as one. It doesn't necessarily mean a monolithic oneness like our sense, the integer one. It doesn't necessarily mean that. When I worked out in the late 80s, I worked at a little drugstore on the west side of town called People's Drugs on West 3rd. When I resigned to go work for Progress, they went out of business. No cause and effect implied. But the other pharmacist that I worked with was a member of the Pentecostal church, a big Pentecostal church on South Curry. They have beautiful trees out front. They deny the Trinity. They believe that God has appeared in different, sometimes as a Father, sometimes as a Son, sometimes as a Spirit, but not three persons. Is that modalism? Is that what that's called?
Yes.
Yes. And we had good discussions, not bad discussions, and we talked about it, but I just thought, I want to present that as there's people who do believe that, and she referred to this verse in Deuteronomy 6:4, the Lord your God is one. That doesn't necessarily mean, and I think Muslims refer to that as well, that doesn't necessarily mean, the word doesn't necessarily mean there can't be parts. For instance, on this page that's oneness, labeled oneness, Genesis 34:15, I will dwell with you and become one people. In other words, it's a oneness that's made up of parts. Numbers 13:23, I think this is when they're coming back from going into the promised land, and they cut down, it's where they had a bunch of grapes that was so big they had to carry it on a pole between their shoulders, you know. A single, in some translations call that one bunch of grapes. So it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as our integer one. It can be a oneness that's made up of parts. Now, interestingly, in the New Testament, Ephesians 5, where Paul's talking about relationships between husband and wife, he says, when they get married, the two become one. As a reflection of Christ and the church. And he says, you know, that's a profound profound mystery. And yes, it is. I don't understand it, and I think he didn't understand it because he calls it a mystery. But the fact is, when two people become married, they become one, but they're still two people. Interestingly, you know, in Genesis 2, when God created the woman, he created her out of Adam. I don't quite understand that. So out of one became two. And then when you get married, the two become one again. So it's not just a union, it's a reunion. John 17:20. Look at down at the bottom of that page. The high priestly prayer of Jesus. He says, I don't pray for these only. Jesus, he's talking to his disciples. So he's not just talking about the disciples who are with him, but also for those who believe in me through their word. That'd be us. That they may be one. Even as thou, Father, art in me, and I in thee, that they may also be in us, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me. So, I think there are two institutions in this fallen world. You can call them social institutions, but they're your uniquely Christian institution, namely Christian marriage and the church, in which we are to reflect the same hierarchy of equals that is in the Trinity. You don't have to agree with that. That's just where I'm going. So that's why I wanted to talk about the Trinity and why I think it's necessary for us before we go on any farther. Historically, the church has had a horrible view of women. In the Old Testament, there would be this phrase where they would confess the sins of their fathers. I don't understand how that. As a male, I want to confess to you females that the church has treated you horribly. And I think it was wrong and unbiblical. For instance, take the paper, The Inferiority of Women. 1, 2, 3, 4. All of them were terrible, but look at the fourth one. That man endowed with a spiritual mind could have believed this, referring to the lie of the servant, is astonishing. Just because it's impossible to believe it. Woman was given to man, woman who was of small intelligence, who perhaps still is more in accordance with the promptings of the inferior flesh than by the superior reason. By Augustine.
What?
No arguments with it. The female sex is easily mistaken, fallible, and poor in intelligence. It's apparent that through women, the devil has vomited this forth. On the second page, this is from a book called How I Changed My Mind, about women in leadership. One humorous story in Brethren Lord about a noted woman missionary who was scheduled to speak to the women's group in the local assembly. The men wanted to hear her story too, but they didn't believe they had the biblical freedom to hear her speak in the meeting room. So they went downstairs and listened to her by loudspeaker. Or another story, I think, is from a Plymouth Brethren. The woman quietly told the man beside her what she wanted to say, and then he repeated this aloud to the meeting. Really, I want to. If you want to keep a copy,
I mean,
I can.
I kind of, you know.
You like the.
No, I mean, it's interesting sources to have, you know, to be able to refer to.
And I think that's why you can never take the history of the church absolutely. We have made some horrible mistakes. The church has made horrible mistakes. I also want to say that I'm an environmentalist, so I'm going to take those home and recycle.
Down the hall.
You make Grace happy.
I don't know if I want to put it down the hall or somebody. So, if you have a Bible, turn to 1 Timothy, or if you've got the manuscript that I handed out, you can look there. I want to look at the first 5 lines. I desire that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling, also that women should adorn themselves modestly and sensibly in seemly apparel, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly attire, but by good deeds, as befits women who profess religion. Paul addresses 2 activities, one by men, one by women. I think they're flip sides of the same coin. They're connected by also. So I think that we shouldn't separate them. First one he brings up is the men. It's when they pray, they shouldn't quarrel. Remember in Matthew 5, Sermon on the Mount, there's this whole series of, I think it's toward the end of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is saying, you have heard it said, but I say to you. You've heard it said, but I say to you. And over again he says that, which is pretty significant just in and of itself. Sometimes he's quoting the Old Testament. Sometimes he's just quoting sayings that went around. Like I think it's the last one where you can't find it anywhere in the Old Testament. But in the one where he quotes the command about you shall not murder, in all of them he extends it. He's not pitting himself against it. He internalizes it. And he goes from, you shall not commit murder, to saying, therefore, you don't even call your brother a fool. You know, don't call him an idiot. And it's apparently a word that refers to mental inability. He gets that from don't commit murder. And then he goes on to say, if you're worshiping, if you're sacrificing at the altar, and you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your sacrifice there and go get straightened out with your things with your brother. A couple of interesting things. One, I think it's encouraging to me that he says your mind might wander. In other words, if you're worshiping and you happen to remember that your brother's got something. I struggle with my mind wandering too, and he acknowledges that. But the interesting thing to me is he says, if you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your altar, stop worshiping, go and straighten things out with your brother. What's more important in the kingdom of God? Going through the motions of worship or having bad relationships? It's like if you're at church and you remember that you're in an argument with somebody, get up and leave church and go straighten it out. I mean, that's really strong. And then in Matthew 18, he talks about if your brother has done something against you, go and confront him with it, get another person as a witness, and then let their dirty underwear tell it to the whole church. The interesting thing to me is it doesn't matter who sinned against whom, if you're the sinner or the sinnee. It's whoever recognizes the problem, on that person, the responsibility is to go and straighten it out. that's how important relationships are between us. So when Paul says, if you're, I mean, it's really kind of amazing to think about it. If you're praying and arguing at the same time, that is just not right. Apparently, that's more a men's issue. He says, I desire in every place, the men should pray lifting holy hands. I don't think he's saying only the men should pray. That would be nonsense. Say women can't pray, only men. That would just be nonsense. But I think he is saying it's a men's problem. Remember back in when we looked at Acts 18 or whatever it was, where Paul makes a prophecy about this church. He said that men would arise from among you trying to lead the sheep astray. And the word refers specifically to males. It's not just humans in general. It's a man's problem, arguing. And of the 6 people that he's listed in the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy, who've drifted from the faith, all of them were men. So I think this thing about the men should pray lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling, in that particular church, it was a men's problem. So he desires that we not have the kind of arguing that causes division and is about getting on top of one another, but instead the kind of discussing of iron sharpen iron. That's legitimate. Lifting holy hands, is that an absolute? I think not. Partly because there are a number of different postures that are described in the Bible appropriate to prayer. Bowing your head, prostrate on the ground, kneeling. So I guess I don't want to make a absolute and say that you have to raise your hands when you pray. I don't know if, I'm not sure what all that represents, but we have 2 grandchildren. One's about 2.5 and one is about 9 or 10 months. And it's interesting that when you go to pick them up, what do? They raise their hands. I don't know if that's what's in mind here, but I tend not to be a hand raiser, but when I do, that's what I think of. It's like I'm raising my hands to my God. Lift me.
Yes.
Take me in your arms.
Thinking, is some of the context like Jewish synagogue worship? I mean, I don't know a whole lot about Jewish synagogue, but
Yeah, you'd probably more
the reading from the prayer book and rocking back and forth and the maybe raising hands in prayer does seem like a distinctive
Jewish.
thing that And,
I don't know the answer to that. I did look up this morning because I couldn't remember what the Shema, what it was called. I looked it up on the computer, and it's part of the Yom Kippur celebration. I think it's the beginning. And when they do it, they cover their eyes. I mentioned in our small group that we're great fans of SVU, Special Victims Unit, and Detective Stabler a couple of weeks ago prayed the Catholic prayer of confession. It blew me away. That's something we don't have a very high view of God's holiness, I think, sometimes, and God's holiness and our lowliness both. That's just an editorial comment. Also, that women should adorn themselves modestly and sensibly in seemly apparel, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly. I hope nobody has braids this morning. I don't. If I were the current kind of person that likes to argue and to prove my superiority and your inferiority, I don't think that's an absolute. I think that's a cultural thing. I do think it's easy to roll our eyes at this and say that doesn't. The issue of competitive dressing, if you want to call it that, doesn't apply now. Let me just ask: what do you think style? Why are we caught up on style? And it's constantly changing. So you have to keep up with it. What is there about style? And even though here it's a women's issue, I don't think now it is only a women's issue. I think men can be just as caught up as anybody else. But what's the significance of style? Why is it so important for us to be current with style?
Searching for approval, and that's one way to get it from the society.
Yeah.
Rather than looking to God.
I mean, it reminds me of the first Samuel, you know, he says men look at the outward appearance.
Yeah.
The Lord looks at the heart, and we are wanting people to comment on the outward appearance.
I don't worry about being stylish exactly, but I do fear being completely unstylish. That's my fear, and I think that rises from like feeling inferior and not wanting to be embarrassed about how I look. Yeah.
There can also be the motive of just not wanting to stand out,
Yeah.
and therefore trying to
Blend.
more or less
Mm-hmm.
be ordinary looking.
It can be a power issue. I mean, like some people, they talk about, you know, your red power tie when you go into an interview, and there's like an issue of power in the
Yeah.
kind of clothes that you wear. Declaring your power by what you wear.
Have any of you seen the movie Witness?
Mm-hmm.
It's an awesome movie.
Yeah.
My grandparents' farm was north of Napanee, it's all Amish around there. And I have a great deal of admiration for the Amish. But they're not perfect. That right across the road, there was a little Amish church with, you know, 2 doors, one for the women, one for the men. And on Sunday mornings, the buggies would just be lined up coming to church. And on Wednesdays afternoon, they'd have evening church, and the men would play baseball, and the women would mow the lawn in their long dresses, you know. And in the movie Witness, one of the characters would say, "You look very plain." That's a compliment, and I think for some Amish, buttons were too
Yes.
ostentatious. It can become a new legalism.
Yeah.
I don't know what we're going to wear in heaven.
Probably not.
Yeah, I see 2 possibilities. One is we'll all have white robes.
Well, yeah.
The other is we won't have anything, which grosses us out because we live on the wrong side of the fall. But either way, it's all the same. There's not going to be any style, nothing outwardly to put ourselves above or below other people. So those are the first 2 issues, one for the men and one for the women. Men, don't argue and pray at the same time. And women, don't get caught up in the competitive, stylish dressing, the need to be more beautiful than other people. Just as an application, I wonder if maybe in church, instead of saying, "I love your hair, I love that new blouse," we should maybe say, "I'm just glad you're here." And, you know, and not be so complimentary on outward appearance.
We had a pastor once who occasionally would admonish us, never go out looking frumpy. Never look frumpy.
Yeah, I mean, that's the opposite
Because you're
extreme.
reflecting Christ.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I mean, when I was younger, you know, I grew up in the 60s and 70s in the hippie era, and I would intentionally go out and look frumpy because that's the opposite extreme.
It's interesting that already we haven't gotten to the hard stuff yet. Right, and we're already talking about how some of this is culturally bound. We've already talked about apparel, and that nowadays men are just as likely to be concerned, maybe not just as likely, but are also likely to be concerned about fashion as women are, and dressing fashionably for all the wrong reasons. We've talked about women, about men praying without anger or quarreling as the male thing, but I think that might just be because they were the ones who had the power to argue with each other in the church. And I think women are just as, capable of arguing as men are.
And quarreling, maybe especially.
Well, maybe. I mean, So, I think that's interesting that we haven't even gotten to the hard part yet. And we're already saying these things, or talking about cultural.
They do seem like cultural workings out of the same principles, though. It doesn't seem like this is just a cultural thing. It doesn't apply to us anymore.
Yes.
The way we're talking about it, it seems like these are
Uh-huh.
things we need to be aware of, even though it's going to work itself out differently today than it would then.
Uh-huh.
But I've made some assumptions about what's cultural and what's not.
Hmm.
I assume that the braided hair is cultural. I don't have any.
Yeah, it does seem like sometimes the, plain dress or something in later, in like Amish kind of groups and things like that would be plain. Braided hair is actually a good way to keep the hair out of the way, and it's
Yeah.
effective, and it's plain, and it's not actually as elaborate, and so, what braids mean, yeah.
Yeah,
Sailors in the 1800s braided their hair.
I'm sorry?
Sailors braided their hair.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
To get out of the wind.
Yep.
Yep.
They were men.
And it's partly, yeah, it's about in church as well, like how do you worship and stuff like that, so it's-
Yeah, we get in very wishy-washy ground and have to make some assumptions. And as we go on, there's nobody that takes what's coming up literally. Nobody.
Mm.
And in fact, when we get to verse 15, I don't know if there's a more difficult verse to understand the whole scripture.
Oh,
And
okay.
nobody takes
Yeah.
that one literally. Let me just suggest two applications so far. One is the importance of right relationships with our brothers and sisters, as opposed to going to worship. Jesus said, stop your worship and go and be reconciled. That's a biblical principle that belongs to the kingdom of heaven, and we ignore it a lot. I ignore it a lot. Don't let the sun go down in your anger, keep short accounts. And then secondly, watching out for the legalism, whether it's dressing up or dressing down.
Mm.
And I'd like us in church to not compliment people on outward attire, but instead compliment them on who they are. I'm glad you're here.
Yep.
I think that's more important than I love your haircut.
I'm gonna say one more thing.
Sure.
It can be a barrier for people to come to church if they feel they don't have the right clothes. If they feel they don't, maybe that's not as much as an issue now as it was, say, 20, 40 years ago, but I remember my mom saying on Easter, I don't have anything to wear, I'm gonna stay home for Easter.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's so much pressure on dressing a certain way. It can be excluding. Yeah.
I read from the book Alice Altshaker by Becky, didn't I? Was that you? Alice Alt, we studied our small group too, and she ends the book by telling a true story about a guy that goes to a new Christian. He goes to a church that's everybody's prim and proper and neckties and everything, and he has long hair and wore blue jeans and dressing up as a clean t-shirt, and there was no place to sit. And he walked down, the center aisle, and there was really no place to sit. So he just walked up in front and sat down on the floor, cross-legged, which I can't do anymore. And one of the elders of the church, who was probably a John Long kind of person, for those of you who remember, you never saw him without a three-piece suit and a tie. And as soon as that guy walked up and sat down, this guy who was sitting towards the back got up, took his cane, and slowly walked up. And everybody was expecting him to confront the person and say, this is not appropriate. And instead, what he does is he sits down and worships with them. That's the way it ought to be in our church. And in any church. I don't mean our ECC, but in any church. Did you want to? Next 4 words, and then we'll have to stop. Boy, and this is what we're coming up on, is stuff where our cultural distance really makes it hard for us to understand what's going on. Let a woman learn. Really? Do you have, this is the last sheet of paper, Jewish thoughts on teaching women? This is the culture where Paul was living. He was a Pharisee, a converted Pharisee, right? A Pharisee of Pharisees. This is what the Jews of that time. The first 4 quotes I found them in my notes and I don't know where it comes from. Some of the other quotes by certain rabbis, and I don't know the time period of them, but I'm pretty sure that the second one down, where a man, 3 blessings every day during his morning prayers, thanks God he didn't make me a Gentile, didn't make me a woman, didn't make me an ignoramus. And I suspect the last 2 were pretty much synonymous. Farther down, the words of the Torah should be burned rather than entrusting them to women. Man shall not teach his daughter the Torah because most women are not intellectually capable of study, but render the words of Torah nonsense because of their ignorance. And I mentioned the profound example of Jesus talking to the woman at the well, and he entrusted her, first person in the book of John, that he says, I'm the Messiah. And the knowledge of the resurrection, the truth of the resurrection, was entrusted to women. In that culture, women were not considered a reliable witness in the courts. Paul says, let a woman learn. So even though he was a Pharisee, he did not buy the Pharisaical teaching, and he was not afraid to buck the system. I know people say both Jesus and Paul didn't want to offend the culture. That's not true. They did. He's doing it right here when he says, let a woman learn. He's considering a woman just as capable of learning as a man. So when he says, let a woman learn, that's profoundly countercultural. We'll go on from here next week and talk about what the word silence really means. It doesn't necessarily mean what we interpret it. Where's our waste basket at? If you want to toss those pages about woman's inability to learn, you can put them in there. We'll see you next week, okay?
All right.